Welcome to the quest for secrets. I'm thrilled you're here as we dive into hidden mysteries, untold stories, and the secrets that shape our world. Where are you tuning in from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below and let's connect across the globe. Chapter 1: An Invitation to Canterbury. Jessica Fletcher had never been to Canterbury before, but the thought of strolling through its cobbled streets, shadowed by the magnificent cathedral spires, was enough to pique her curiosity. When she received an official invitation from the University of Kent to speak at their annual Crime Writers' Symposium, she didn't hesitate. A quiet week in a historic English town, surrounded by fellow writers, academics, and old books. It sounded like heaven. The symposium was set to take place in early autumn, when the air was crisp and the leaves painted the city in warm shades of gold and crimson. Jessica arrived on a mild Thursday afternoon, dragging her suitcase through the quaint city centre. She couldn't help but admire the centuries-old buildings with ivy creeping up their sides and the quiet hum of market vendors calling out to tourists. Her hotel, the Bishopsgate Inn, was a converted 18th-century townhouse nestled a stone's throw from the cathedral. A polite young porter carried her bag up to the third floor, where her room overlooked the serene garden courtyard. After settling in, Jessica decided to stretch her legs and get a feel for the town. She wandered past the Gothic facade of Canterbury Cathedral, pausing to take a photo before continuing down a narrow alley lined with bookshops and tea rooms. Just as she was admiring a display of antique maps in a store window, her phone buzzed. A text from the university coordinator, Dr. Harriet Langston, read: "Welcome to Canterbury, Mrs. Fletcher. Looking forward to seeing you at tomorrow's opening dinner at Harrow House. 7 p.m. sharp. Formal attire. H.L. Harrow House." Jessica had seen the name in the brochure. It was a stately manor just outside the city, owned by Reginald Harrow, a prominent antiques dealer and symposium patron. His daughter, Emily Harrow, was co-hosting the dinner and was also rumored to be preparing a book on the darker side of her family's past. That evening, Jessica dined alone at the hotel restaurant. She noticed a few other writers at nearby tables, their name tags giving them away. She waved at one or two familiar faces and then returned to her grilled salmon and notebook, jotting down ideas for a short story inspired by the medieval charm of Canterbury. But her peaceful mood was interrupted when a young woman rushed into the lobby, visibly shaken. She wore a long navy coat, her dark hair in disarray, and clutched a small handbag to her chest. Jessica watched as she approached the reception desk, breathless. "Have you seen Emily?" "Emily Harrow?" she asked urgently. The clerk shook his head, puzzled. "I'm sorry, miss. She hasn't checked in here." The young woman turned and spotted Jessica watching her. Their eyes met for a moment. Jessica smiled kindly, but the woman quickly looked away and exited the hotel just as suddenly as she had arrived. Jessica frowned slightly. It was probably nothing, but something about the girl's expression unsettled her. Panic mixed with fear, perhaps even guilt? The next day passed in a flurry of academic discussions and panel rehearsals. Jessica gave a warm lecture on the parallels between real-world investigations and fictional plotting. She was graciously received, especially by the younger writers who flocked to her for advice. Still, in the back of her mind, the image of the distressed woman from the night before lingered. That evening, dressed in a navy evening gown and pearls, Jessica arrived at Harrow House. The manor was as grand as the guidebook described, ivy-covered stone, tall windows glowing with soft light, and an ornate fountain in the circular drive. Inside, the rooms were decorated with antiques, velvet drapes, and portraits of stern-looking ancestors. Emily Harrow was noticeably absent. Jessica noticed it immediately, guests whispering, Dr. Langston casting glances at her phone, and Reginald Harrow making vague excuses about his daughter running late. But as the hours passed, worry began to creep in. Emily's seat remained empty at the dinner table. Her phone was unreachable. No one had seen her since the previous night. By the time dessert was served, Reginald stood to speak, his voice tense despite the smile he tried to wear. "Please forgive Emily's absence tonight. She's not feeling well," he said quickly, and changed the subject. But Jessica didn't believe it. She remembered the frightened girl from the hotel lobby. She remembered the rumors of Emily's research into family secrets. And she knew, somehow, that this quiet little city, steeped in history, was about to become the scene of something far more sinister than a literary seminar. Something had happened to Emily Harrow. Jessica could feel it. And she would find out what. Chapter 2: The Vanishing of Emily Harrow. The morning after the dinner at Harrow House, Canterbury was cloaked in a thick, pearly mist. Jessica Fletcher sat at a corner table in the hotel dining room, sipping her tea and reviewing her notes from the day before. The gentle clatter of cutlery and murmured conversations filled the air, but her focus was elsewhere. Emily Harrow had never appeared. Jessica flipped open the Canterbury Gazette someone had left behind. No mention of the Harrow family or the symposium. Just a front-page article about a local museum exhibition on World War II artifacts and a story about rising rent prices near the cathedral. Business as usual, it seemed. But Jessica's instincts were rarely wrong, and something about last night gnawed at her. The overly rehearsed excuse from Reginald Harrow. The strained expression on Dr. Langston's face. And most of all, that panicked young woman who had rushed into the hotel asking for Emily. She had barely touched her toast when her phone vibrated. It was a message from Dr. Langston. "Jessica, can we speak privately? Something's happened. Emily is missing." Jessica's heart skipped. Dr. Langston met her in the university's staff lounge an hour later. The professor looked disheveled, tired eyes, a coffee stain on her scarf, and a tremble in her voice that didn't suit her usual composure. "She hasn't been seen since yesterday morning," she said quietly. "None of her friends have heard from her. Her phone is off. And her car is still parked in the estate garage." "Has anyone contacted the police?" Jessica asked gently. Langston nodded. "Reginald reported her missing this morning, but, privately, I think he was hoping she'd just turn up. Emily was fiercely independent. She could be dramatic, especially when researching her book, but this feels different." "Tell me about the book," Jessica said. Langston hesitated. It was going to be a memoir, part family history, part expose. Emily had uncovered something about her great-grandfather's antique business during the war. Rumors of stolen artifacts, backroom deals, even forged provenance papers. She told me she believed someone close to the family wanted to stop her from publishing. That piece fell into place like a key in a lock. "And the woman who came to my hotel last night, looking for Emily, do you know who that could have been?" Langston blinked in surprise. "No one's mentioned that." "What did she look like?" "Dark hair, mid-20s. Distressed. Didn't leave her name." Langston shook her head. "I'll ask around. Emily's circle is small. If she was that upset, she may have known something." Later that afternoon, Jessica went for a walk through Westgate Gardens. The gentle river ran beside the path, an old weeping willow swayed over the water. It should have been peaceful, but her mind raced. She paused on a stone bench, replaying what she knew. Emily had disappeared just as her book was nearing completion. There were whispers of family secrets, secrets that threatened reputations and possibly fortunes. And someone, maybe more than one person, didn't want the truth coming out. She pulled out her phone and searched for news. Still no updates. But as she stood to leave, she noticed someone watching her from the far end of the path. The woman from the hotel lobby. Their eyes met again. This time, the woman didn't flee. She slowly approached. "You're Jessica Fletcher," she said, her voice cautious. I saw you at Harrow House." "I remember you," Jessica replied calmly. "You were looking for Emily." The woman nodded, then looked over her shoulder, clearly nervous. "I shouldn't be talking to you. I think something bad has happened. And I'm scared." Jessica gestured to the bench. "Sit down. Let's talk." The woman hesitated, then lowered herself onto the bench beside her. "My name is Rachel Phelps. I'm a freelance researcher. Emily hired me 6 months ago to help dig through Harrow family archives. Old ledgers, letters, journals. We found things that could ruin her father's legacy. She was convinced her grandfather was involved in Nazi art trafficking during the war." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "That's a dangerous accusation." "I know. But Emily said she had proof. She'd found something important. A ledger, I think. She was going to confront her father. That was 2 days ago. I haven't heard from her since." "Did she tell anyone else?" Jessica asked. Rachel hesitated. "No one we could trust. But she did say if anything happened to her, I should go to the police. I was too afraid. I thought maybe she'd just left. But now..." Jessica put a hand on Rachel's. "You've done the right thing by coming to me." Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. "If Emily's really missing, I think someone took her." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. Kidnapping. That changed everything. Chapter 3: Clues in the Crypt. The following morning, a cold drizzle coated Canterbury in a thin sheen of moisture, making the cobblestones slick and the air heavy. Jessica Fletcher stood beneath the vast archway of Canterbury Cathedral, her trench coat buttoned up tightly as she glanced toward the heavens. A light mist swirled through the cathedral square, as though the city itself held its breath. She had called ahead, requesting a private tour of the cathedral archives. The Harrow family, according to Rachel Phelps, had long-standing ties to the cathedral, both as donors and as keepers of a private memorial chapel within the crypt. Emily had mentioned visiting the site multiple times during her research. It was a long shot, but Jessica had followed thinner threads in the past. A young verger named Elliot Horne met her at the grand wooden doors. With a bashful smile and jangling keys, he led her down a series of narrow stone stairways, the scent of dust and cold stone growing stronger with each step. "The Harrow Chapel is just beyond the choir's resting vaults," Elliot explained. "It's not open to the public, private family section. Very old. Some parts haven't been touched in decades." They passed rows of ancient tombs, dimly lit by soft yellow wall lamps. Jessica's footsteps echoed faintly behind Elliot's as they entered the narrow hall that led to the private chapel. "Emily came here, didn't she?" Jessica asked as they walked. Elliot nodded. 3 or 4 times over the last 2 months. She said she was working on a book. Always had a notebook and a little satchel of papers. She asked a lot of questions about the war years. Inside the chapel, a stone altar stood beneath a faded stained glass window. The space was still and silent, except for the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. Brass plaques lined the walls, engraved with the names of Harrow ancestors. A few faded wreaths sat undisturbed in the corners. Jessica took it in slowly. "Did Emily ever mention finding anything unusual down here?" She asked about a missing cornerstone. Elliot replied, pointing to the floor at the edge of the altar. "She said one of the old blueprints showed something underneath that spot, but we always assumed it was just artist's interpretation." Jessica knelt and examined the floor. The tiles were worn and cracked, but one stone near the altar was slightly raised at the corner. She took a pen from her coat and gently worked it under the edge. With a soft click, the stone lifted, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside was an object wrapped in oilcloth. Elliot let out a low gasp. I had no idea. Jessica carefully pulled the bundle out and unwrapped it. Inside was a beaded rosary, old but intact. Its cross was engraved with the initials JHH, Jonathan Henry Harrow, Emily's grandfather. But something else had been tucked into the folds of the cloth. A small envelope, yellowed and sealed with wax. Jessica opened it delicately. Inside was a folded letter. Written in flowing cursive, dated September 2nd, 1946. To whom it may concern. If this letter is ever found, it means the truth may finally see daylight. The items brought into this country in 1943 under my name were not all legally acquired. Some were stolen, some worse. I have kept the ledger hidden, but not destroyed. My conscience won't allow it. The truth rests in the vault behind St. Agnes. God forgive me. JHH. Jessica exchanged a glance with Elliot. This could be the motive Emily uncovered. She may have found the ledger, or at least known where to look. Elliot looked pale. Do you think this has something to do with her disappearance? I do, Jessica said softly. And if she found this same letter before vanishing, someone else may have followed her trail. As they left the chapel, Jessica's mind raced. Vault behind St. Agnes. That could mean another location, perhaps an old church or even a tomb. But it also meant that Emily had likely been getting close to something explosive, evidence not just of wartime theft, but of a decades-long cover-up. Outside the cathedral, the mist had lifted slightly, but a deeper fog settled over Jessica's thoughts. Emily had been tracing a buried truth, one her own family likely wanted kept silent. And now, Jessica had uncovered a critical clue. But if she had, so could the person who had taken Emily. Or worse, murdered her. Chapter 4: The Inspector's Cold Stare. The Kent Police Headquarters in Canterbury was a squat, grey building that looked more like an uninspired insurance office than the centre of local law enforcement. Jessica Fletcher sat patiently in a sparsely decorated waiting room, her purse resting in her lap and the envelope containing the letter from the cathedral's crypt tucked safely inside. She had called ahead and requested to speak with the lead investigator on the Emily Harrow case. After a brief delay, the receptionist pointed her to an interview room and said, "Detective Inspector Clara Redford will see you shortly." The door opened with a soft click, and in walked a woman in her late 30s, tall, composed, and sharply dressed in a dark blazer and tailored slacks. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her expression was unreadable behind the cool precision of her steel blue eyes. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said curtly, extending a hand. "Inspector Clara Redford. I understand you found something related to the Harrow investigation." Jessica stood and shook her hand politely. "Yes, thank you for seeing me. I believe what I've uncovered may be relevant." Redford sat across from her, folding her arms. "I'm listening." Jessica placed the rosary and the letter on the table. These were hidden beneath the Harrow family chapel in the cathedral crypt. I believe Emily found them before she disappeared. Redford glanced at the items, barely reacting. A religious trinket and an old letter. More than that, Jessica replied gently. The letter was written by Jonathan Henry Harrow, Emily's grandfather. He admits to smuggling stolen artifacts during World War II and mentions a ledger hidden somewhere near St. Agnes. Redford's brow twitched, but she remained calm. Even if authentic, it's circumstantial. Nothing directly ties it to the current investigation. Except that Emily was researching this very history for a book, Jessica added. And she went missing right after telling her assistant, Rachel Phelps, that she had found something significant. Redford gave her a measured look. You seem remarkably invested in this case for someone who only arrived in town a few days ago. Jessica smiled politely. I've been involved in my fair share of investigations, Inspector. I recognize when something is being covered up and when someone may be in danger for revealing the truth. There was a pause. Redford stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the parking lot below. When she spoke again, her voice had a faint edge to it. Let me make something clear, Mrs. Fletcher. This is an official police investigation. While I respect your reputation, I don't need amateur detectives getting involved, spreading theories, or disturbing potential crime scenes. I understand completely, Jessica replied calmly. But if Emily was abducted, or worse, it may not have been random. Someone with something to lose may have taken steps to silence her. Redford turned around, arms still folded. We're treating this as a missing persons case. No signs of forced entry, no ransom demands, no confirmed threats. Emily Harrow is a wealthy, young woman with a history of strong opinions and a flair for dramatics. Until we find a body, or a kidnapper, we don't assume the worst. Jessica stood, collecting her purse. Forgive me, Inspector. But in my experience, assuming the best can be just as dangerous. As she reached the door, Redford spoke again, her tone softer, but not warmer. If you do find anything else, come to me directly. No detours. No press. Understood. Jessica nodded. Of course. Outside the station, the clouds had thickened again, and the breeze had turned colder. Jessica walked slowly, her thoughts spinning. She could tell that Inspector Redford was intelligent, sharp, even, but also cautious to a fault. She wouldn't pursue any line of inquiry that couldn't be documented, signed, sealed, and verified twice over. Which meant if Emily really had been kidnapped, or murdered, the truth might slip through her fingers before she even realized it. As Jessica passed a row of brick townhouses, she spotted a familiar face waiting on a nearby bench. Rachel Phelps. The young researcher stood when she saw Jessica, clutching a canvas satchel. I found something, she said breathlessly. Jessica raised an eyebrow. Where? Rachel opened the satchel and pulled out a folded page. It's a map of the Harrow estate from the 1800s. There's a section labelled a Street Point Agnes Vault on the far western edge of the property, beneath an old gardener's cottage. It was boarded up years ago. Jessica took the map and studied it closely. A small hex marked a square structure near a copse of trees. The cottage was barely visible from the rest of the property on aerial maps. Emily thought the ledger might be hidden there, Rachel whispered. She said if anything ever happened to her, to go there first. Jessica's gaze darkened. She was right, she said. And someone didn't want her to get there. Chapter 5, A Murder in the Garden. Twilight settled over Canterbury like a velvet curtain, and the grounds of Harrow House were cloaked in creeping shadows. Jessica Fletcher stood near the rusted gate that marked the overgrown western edge of the estate, Rachel Phelps by her side. They had followed the old estate map to the edge of a neglected path that once led to the gardener's cottage. Now, only the faintest trace of cobblestones peeked through the tangled grass and fallen leaves. There, Rachel said, pointing. Just beyond those hedges. The pair moved carefully, pushing aside branches and vines until the small stone cottage came into view. It was covered in ivy, its wooden door rotted and hanging off its hinges. Moss crept up the base, and a crow cawed sharply from a nearby tree as they approached. Jessica stepped cautiously into the structure. The interior was cold, damp, and filled with decaying tools and crumbling shelves. But at the back of the room, hidden behind a pile of broken crates, was what they were looking for, a trapdoor. Rachel gasped. I didn't think it would actually be here. Jessica knelt and brushed away the dust and debris. The iron ring was stiff, but she managed to pull it open with effort. Beneath it lay a narrow stone staircase descending into pitch-black darkness. Jessica looked at Rachel. "Wait here." Before Rachel could protest, Jessica switched on the flashlight she'd brought and began descending into the vault alone. The stairs creaked beneath her, and the musty air thickened as she reached the bottom. The narrow chamber was lined with crumbling shelves and mold-covered wooden crates. At the far end of the room, half buried beneath a sheet of canvas, Jessica found a small, rusted lockbox. She knelt, heart pounding. The lock had been broken recently. As she slowly opened the lid, a chill ran down her spine. Inside were several aged ledgers, wrapped in cloth. The top one bore the Harrow family crest, alongside a note, dated just last week, in Emily's handwriting. "For safekeeping. In case I don't return." Jessica's breath caught. Emily had been here. She stood up to examine the rest of the vault, when suddenly a scream rang out above her. "Rachel!" Jessica bolted up the stairs, pushing the trapdoor open with a sharp crack. The dim light of evening greeted her, but Rachel was no longer at the doorway. Jessica called her name. No answer. She rushed out into the tangled garden, heart racing, scanning the hedgerows and twisted trees. And then she saw it. Just past the edge of the maze, beneath the gnarled branches of a yew tree, a figure lay crumpled in the grass. Jessica ran, nearly slipping in the mud. As she got closer, dread filled her chest. It wasn't Rachel. It was Emily Harrow. She lay motionless, her long coat soaked through, her pale skin smeared with dirt. Her eyes were closed. There was blood on her temple. Jessica knelt beside her and felt for a pulse. Nothing. She whispered Emily's name, though she already knew it was too late. Emily Harrow was dead. 10 minutes later, flashing blue lights lit up the night as police cars pulled into the estate drive. Officers cordoned off the garden, and crime scene tape fluttered in the wind like yellow streamers of grief. Jessica stood near the hedgerow, arms crossed tightly as Inspector Clara Redford arrived on the scene. Redford's eyes widened at the sight of the body, but she quickly slipped into professionalism. "Where did you find her?" Jessica pointed. "Near the outer edge of the maze. I believe she'd been moved, her shoes were muddy, but the soles were clean. She didn't walk there herself." "And what were you doing here, Mrs. Fletcher?" Redford asked, voice clipped. "I was following a lead Emily left behind. A hidden vault on the estate. I found a ledger with evidence of her family's dealings during the war, and a note in her handwriting. She was alive when she wrote it. I believe she was taken, held somewhere, and possibly brought back here to be silenced." Redford blinked. "So you're saying this is no longer a missing persons case?" Jessica met her gaze firmly. "No, Inspector. It's murder." Redford exhaled slowly. "Where's Rachel Phelps?" Jessica looked around. Her stomach dropped. Rachel was gone. Later that evening, back at the hotel, Jessica sat alone in her room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. The image of Emily's lifeless body haunted her. The young woman had fought to uncover her family's secrets, and she had paid the ultimate price. Someone, perhaps even someone in Emily's inner circle, had wanted her quiet. The ledger was real. The confession from her grandfather was real. And now the killer was desperate. Desperate enough to kill again. Jessica stared out the window at the city lights. She had solved many murders in her time. But this one was getting personal. Chapter 6, The Silent Butler. The morning after Emily Harrow's murder, Harrow House felt more like a mausoleum than a manor. Jessica Fletcher stood once again in the grand marble-floored foyer, this time not as a guest, but as someone determined to uncover the truth. Outside, police tape still fluttered in the wind, and officers moved methodically across the property. The garden maze, now cordoned off, had become a crime scene. The media had begun circling. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Jessica was greeted by a familiar figure, Mr. Gerald Webb, the family butler of over 40 years. A tall man in his 70s with a long, lined face and posture so rigid he could have passed for one of the marble statues in the drawing room. "Good morning, Mrs. Fletcher," he said in a low, steady tone. "Inspector Redford mentioned you might stop by." "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Webb." "I understand this must be difficult," Jessica said gently. His eyes didn't flicker. "It is not the first tragedy this house has seen, madam. Though I had hoped it would be the last." Jessica studied him. Webb had always been polite, bordering on invisible, a shadow moving between rooms, offering wine or adjusting the curtains. But Jessica had learned long ago that butlers often noticed everything, even when they said nothing. "I wonder if I could ask you a few questions about Emily," she said. Webb led her into a quiet sitting room. "Of course." Jessica sat down opposite him. "You've known her since birth." "I have. I served her father and her grandfather before him." "And were you aware that Emily was investigating her family's past?" Webb hesitated. "I suspected. She spent long hours in the old study. Asked to see archived shipping records. Once requested I unlock a wine cellar that hadn't been opened since the 1950s. I asked no questions." "Did she ever mention finding anything dangerous? Anything upsetting?" Webb's lips pressed into a thin line. "She mentioned finding a letter. She seemed disturbed. Said it confirmed what she feared." Jessica leaned forward. "Do you know what the letter said?" "No, madam. But the night she read it, she didn't eat. She walked the grounds until well past midnight. I offered to bring her tea, but she refused." A pause. "That was the last time I truly saw her." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "And what about the night she vanished? Where were you?" "In the pantry. Inventory for the gala dinner. I did not leave my post." But Emily's assistant, Rachel Phelps, came to the hotel looking for her. She seemed terrified. "Miss Phelps," Webb said slowly, "was never entirely welcome here. Emily trusted her, but the rest of the household did not." "Why?" Webb gave a subtle shrug. "Too curious. Always asking questions. Always listening at doors." Jessica stood and walked to the window. Outside, a pair of officers searched the garden wall. Then something caught her eye, or the greenhouse. It sat on the far edge of the estate, its glass panes fogged with age. "I'd like to see the greenhouse," she said suddenly. Webb hesitated. "It's not been used in years." "Humor me," Jessica replied. 10 minutes later, they stepped inside the dusty structure. Weeds had claimed the corners, and broken flower pots littered the floor. A layer of dirt covered every surface. But Jessica noticed something odd, a recent footprint in the soil near a potting bench. It hadn't rained in days. Whoever had been here came after the murder. She stepped closer and noticed a rusted watering can, tipped slightly against the wall. She nudged it aside, and something metallic glinted beneath it. A key. She picked it up. Old, but polished. Not rusted like the rest of the tools. It had initials engraved faintly on its stem, VH. Jessica turned to Webb. "Do you know what this opens?" He took the key, turned it in his hand, and his face went very still. "That belongs to the vault in the cellar. Victoria Harrow's vault." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Emily's great-aunt." He nodded. She died during the Blitz. The vault hasn't been opened in over 70 years. No one's had reason to, until now. Jessica's heart quickened. If someone had retrieved the key recently, it meant they were trying to access something hidden there. Something Emily may have found, and died for. "Will you show me the vault?" she asked quietly. Webb stared at the key. "Of course, madam." As they made their way back inside, Jessica's phone buzzed. A message from Inspector Redford. "Rachel Phelps has returned. She's claiming someone tried to push her into the garden well last night." Jessica stared at the message. Whoever had killed Emily wasn't done yet. And now they were getting desperate. Chapter 7: A Locked Room, A Hidden Will. The cellar beneath Harrow House was colder than Jessica expected. A damp chill seeped through the stone walls, and the air held the heavy stillness of a place long forgotten. Jessica followed Mr. Webb down the spiral steps, flashlight in hand, the iron key marked VH clutched tightly in her coat pocket. "This is it," Webb said, stopping before a thick oak door reinforced with iron bands. "The vault. Miss Victoria Harrow's private archive. It hasn't been opened since before my time. The family sealed it after her death." Jessica pulled out the key and gently inserted it into the lock. It turned with surprising ease, followed by a loud click. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small room filled with dust-covered shelves, old trunks, and a writing desk pushed into the far wall. Cobwebs clung to everything. Jessica stepped inside and swept her flashlight across the room. Faded documents, bundles of letters, and yellowed papers lay scattered across the desk as if someone had once fled in haste. A broken porcelain lamp sat in the corner, its cord still dangling from the socket. She moved toward a large leather-bound folder marked Private VH and gently opened it. Inside were legal documents, contracts, property deeds, and something more startling, a will. Dated 1947, it was signed and sealed by Victoria Harrow. Jessica's eyes widened as she read. The document amended the Harrow family inheritance. Instead of leaving the estate solely to Reginald Harrow and his descendants, Victoria had designated a second heir, a woman named Margaret Voss, her personal companion during the war. The will included details of artwork and valuables recovered from Europe, with instructions that certain items be returned to families in France and Austria. A postscript at the bottom read, "Should Reginald or Jonathan dispute this, it confirms their knowledge of what was stolen." Jessica's heart pounded. Emily had found this. This will, and possibly others like it, could destroy the Harrow legacy and prove that her grandfather had knowingly kept stolen wartime treasures. The motive for murder was no longer vague, it was crystal clear. She slipped the will into her bag, then turned to Webb. "Did Emily ever speak to you about a woman named Margaret Voss?" Webb nodded slowly. "She did. She believed Miss Voss was more than just Victoria's companion. She thought she was family. Meaning Emily may not have been the sole heir after all," Jessica murmured. "If that will had gone public, Reginald would have lost everything, and Emily's claim to the estate would have been challenged." Webb's face darkened. "It would explain a great deal." Back upstairs, Jessica found Inspector Clara Redford waiting for her in the drawing room, arms folded, a firm expression on her face. Rachel Phelps sat nearby, pale and shaken, a bruise visible on her wrist. "She's lucky to be alive," Redford said sharply. "Someone tried to shove her into the old well. If the groundskeeper hadn't been walking his dog, we might be looking at another murder." Jessica nodded solemnly. "And I think I know why." She handed Redford the will. Redford read in silence, her eyes narrowing. "This changes everything," she finally said. "If Reginald knew about this will, and I'm willing to bet he did, then Emily's discovery would have made him a suspect. he stood to lose his entire inheritance, along with his reputation. And if he thought Emily was going to publish it, Jessica let the sentence hang in the air. Redford glanced at Rachel. Did Emily ever tell her father about the will? I don't know, Rachel stammered. But she said she'd confronted someone. Someone close. Jessica turned to Redford. Reginald needs to be questioned again. And his study, his private room. Has it been searched? Redford frowned. He refused. Said it was confidential business property. But now, she looked at the will again. I think we have probable cause. 2 hours later, Jessica stood beside Redford as police officers opened the double doors to Reginald Harrow's study. The room was lavish, filled with antique maps, brass instruments, and framed awards. But behind the large mahogany desk, concealed in a locked cabinet, they found what they were looking for. The original ledger Emily had mentioned, detailing stolen art transactions dating back to 1943. A copy of Victoria's will, with a corner torn, as if someone had ripped it from Emily's files. And, most chillingly, a pair of mud-caked shoes tucked behind the desk. Jessica looked at Redford. The soles matched the prints in the greenhouse. Redford nodded grimly. And the time of Emily's death matches the window when Reginald was arresting her before the gala. Rachel whispered, he killed her. Jessica's voice was firm. Or had someone do it for him. Either way, he knew the truth. And tried to bury it. Just like his father before him. Redford gave the order. Bring him in. As police moved to detain Reginald Harrow for questioning, Jessica stepped out onto the front steps of Harrow House, the crisp evening air brushing against her cheeks. The garden, the house, the history, they were all heavy with secrets. But one thing was clear now. The truth was no longer buried. Chapter 8, Justice in Canterbury. 2 days later, the bells of Canterbury Cathedral rang solemnly in the early morning mist. The grand stone towers rose through thinning fog as the city woke slowly, unaware that justice had just quietly caught up with an old legacy of secrets. Inside the Kent Police headquarters, Reginald Harrow sat in a grey interview room, his hands trembling slightly as Inspector Clara Redford laid out the evidence piece by piece, Emily's note from the crypt, the forged records in his study, the hidden will, and finally, the mud-stained shoes. Jessica Fletcher stood quietly in the observation room, arms crossed, watching the unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. She had seen this moment many times before, the proud facade cracking, the truth too heavy to carry any longer. Reginald had confessed, though not to murder. He admitted to hiding Victoria's will, forging documents to maintain his inheritance, and silencing Emily by threatening her, though he claimed he never meant for her to die. But the real twist came just hours earlier. Gerald Webb, the butler, had turned himself in. The silent, loyal servant had discovered Emily's plans to expose the Harrow legacy. Fearing it would destroy the family, and driven by decades of misplaced loyalty, he had lured her back to the estate under the pretense of helping her secure evidence. When she resisted handing over the documents, a struggle ensued in the garden. A fall. A stone. A single blow. It wasn't premeditated. But it was fatal. Webb's confession had shaken the household to its core. Jessica had suspected him, his practiced silence, his precise words, but it was still a tragedy. When she met him in the hallway outside his holding cell, he had only said, "I tried to preserve the house. But I should have protected her instead." That evening, a small memorial was held for Emily Harrow inside the cathedral. It was a quiet affair, just a few of her friends, university colleagues, and Rachel Phelps, who read aloud an excerpt from Emily's unfinished manuscript. The truth is never buried forever. No matter how deep the earth, how thick the stone, it whispers its way to the surface, one page, one voice, one breath at a time. Jessica felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't cry often. But this case, this young woman's fight to bring light to a shadowed legacy, had touched her deeply. When the service ended, she and Rachel stepped out into the courtyard, the stars barely beginning to pierce the night sky. She was brave, Rachel said softly. She knew what it would cost her. And she went ahead anyway. Jessica placed a hand gently on her shoulder. And you were brave for helping her. You never gave up. Rachel nodded. What happens to the will now? The authorities will ensure it's honored, Jessica said. Victoria's wishes will be fulfilled. Margaret Voss's descendants, if they can be traced, will finally have their part of the legacy. And some of the stolen art will be returned. For once, Rachel whispered, the past doesn't win. The next morning, Jessica packed her bags at the Bishopsgate Inn. Her flight back to Cabot Cove awaited. As she zipped her suitcase, she glanced at the folded copy of Emily's manuscript Rachel had given her, a draft the world would now see thanks to her efforts. There was a knock at the door. Inspector Clara Redford stood there, not as cold as before. I wanted to say goodbye, she said. Jessica smiled. And I wanted to say thank you for trusting me, eventually. Redford gave a tight but sincere nod. You were right from the beginning. About the instincts. The connections. I don't usually work well with outsiders, but you're not exactly ordinary. Jessica chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. As they shook hands, Redford added, if you're ever in London and feel like solving another murder, I'll make sure Scotland Yard clears a desk for you. Jessica smiled. Only if there's tea involved. As the train pulled out of Canterbury station and the countryside rolled past her window, Jessica Fletcher opened her notebook and began to write. Not a mystery, this time. A tribute. To a brave young woman. To truth. To justice in Canterbury. The end.